In 1866, Texas, the dinner that kept a cowboy alive did not begin with a giant steak. It began with a wagon capable of carrying flour, cans, fat, and fire for months. And some of today's most repeated authentic Wild West recipes did not even exist during the great cattle drives. Son of a gun, stew. The strangest named stew in camp was not a punishment for an unlucky cowboy. On the hardest working days, it could become one of the crew's most valued meals. After Charles Goodnight adapted his chuck wagon in Texas in 1866, trail cooks had pots and tools that let them use ingredients that would not survive a journey without refrigeration. National Park Service materials connect son-of-a-gun stew with slaughter days during cattle drives and roundups, especially in the 1866 to 1885 open-range era. This was not the daily ration seen in movies. It was an occasional meal made with meat and organ cuts from a freshly slaughtered animal, precisely because those parts had to be eaten quickly. The polite name also covered a rougher expression used among the men. For the cook, wasting food meant leaving an entire crew with less energy later. The stew turned perishability into an advantage and proved that timing, more than preference, controlled the menu. The same roundup produced an even smaller serving whose name made every newcomer imagine the wrong food. 2. Prairie oysters. Prairie oysters did not come from the sea, and no cowboy had to find a shell in the grasslands. The elegant nickname concealed a food created by roundup work. Accounts assembled by historian Richard Slatta describe prairie oysters at Western and Canadian roundups in the late 19th century. They were parts removed while calves were being managed and castrated, then cooked immediately over coals or in a skillet. That setting matches major cattle operations of the 1870s and 1880s, from Texas to the northern ranges. The surprise is not only the ingredient. Prairie oysters were not a planned chuck wagon inventory item. They appeared at one particular point in the ranch calendar, so calling them a standard meal on every cattle drive bends the evidence. Without refrigeration, the crew had to use what the day's work made available. For tired young hands, that small serving added fresh food to a menu dominated by flour, preserved meat, and coffee. If this dish depended on roundup season, the next dessert depended on the opposite: dry ingredients that could survive for weeks inside a wagon. 3. Spotted pup rice. With raisins sounds too delicate for a cattle trail, but this pudding reveals something Western movies often miss. The cook also had to manage crew morale. The National Park Service lists spotted pup among chuck wagon desserts associated with the open-range era, roughly 1865 to 1890. At ranches such as Grant Coors in Montana, cooks carried dry provisions on long journeys and used Dutch ovens for bread as well as sweets. The spots were raisins. The pup existed only in the nickname. More importantly, rice and dried fruit did not grow beside the campfire. They had to be purchased, measured, and protected from rain, making the dessert evidence of logistics rather than romantic improvisation. A sweet serving broke the monotony and could ease tension after hours of dust, cold, or storms. Cooks earned higher pay and unusual authority because feeding men well also meant keeping them working together. But when even raisins were unavailable, cooks could imitate the brightness of fruit with something few people expect inside a pie. 4. Vinegar pie. Vinegar pie was not designed to make cowboys enjoy sour food. A little acidity created the impression of fruit pie when no fruit was available. Vinegar pie recipes appear in 19th century American food traditions. The Denver Public Library documents the pie in a living history program based on an 1860s Colorado farm, while frontier kitchens depended on flour, sweetener, fat, and vinegar, supplies far more durable than fresh fruit. The recipe is historically real, but its direct connection to every cattle drive is weaker than the evidence for canned tomatoes or spotted pup. The responsible description is a pantry solution used in homes, ranches, and some camps, not a universal cowboy dessert. That still explains its value. A crust and sweet tart filling transformed ordinary provisions into an emotional pause. When supply lines failed, suggesting the taste of fruit preserved a small sense of normal life. The next dough needed no filling, plate, or conventional oven, and it traveled across the northern continent far beyond Texas. 5. Bannock looked like a simple flatbread, but its strength came from everything it did not require: long fermentation, delicate equipment, or a permanent kitchen. Parks Canada preserves a Campfire Bannock recipe associated with Alberta's Bar U Ranch, established in 1882. Flour, salt, fat, and liquid could become a dough cooked in a skillet, beside the fire, or in a camp oven. The name arrived through Scottish traditions, while North American forms were remade across indigenous, Métis, settler, and ranch communities. Calling it simply a cowboy invention erases the cultural roots that carried this bread into camps. For a moving crew, dry ingredients occupied little room and tolerated long journeys. The cook could adapt the dough to fuel, weather, and available time, producing hot food even when the main wagon was distant. Farther south, another quick cornmeal dish carried an older history, one that began before the cattle drives and outside the books written by cowboys. 6. Cush. One of the easiest dishes to imagine in a ranch skillet did not begin in the myth of the white cowboy. Cush, or Cush, points back to African-American kitchens formed long before the Great Trails. Narratives preserved by the Library of Congress describe Cush as a mixture of cornbread or cornmeal, fat, onion, and seasoning in the kitchens of enslaved people across the South. After the Civil War, beginning in 1865, workers, veterans, and cattle hands carried Southern food habits into Texas and the West. The dish is real. What requires caution is claiming that it appeared in every chuck wagon. Direct cattle drive menus are limited. Even so, crumbling cornbread into a skillet with fat and seasonings fit ranch provisions perfectly. Recognizing that origin changes who becomes visible in the story. Survival techniques traveled with black workers and cooks who were rarely identified by name even when their knowledge fed an entire crew. When cornbread received crisp pieces from ranch butchering, it gained another name and a different place in cowboy routine. 7. Cracklin cornbread. Cracklin cornbread sounds like ideal trail food, but its strongest historical setting is the ranch and bunkhouse, where cooks had time to render fat and save the crisp pieces. Historian Byron Price notes that cornmeal and bread were already part of cowboy provisions before 1870. In the post-Civil War South and Texas, cracklings, the small crisp remnants from rendering pork fat, were mixed into batter to add flavor and energy. Cornmeal was common. Cracklin cornbread on every drive was not. A moving chuck wagon did not always carry the ingredients and labor of ranch butchering. This food describes the home base that supplied the trail more reliably than every open-air supper. At the bunkhouse, using leftovers reduced waste and made plain batter more satisfying. It was a domestic technology of economy, carried by families and cooks into cattle culture. The same gap between working kitchen and legend appears in the cowboy's most famous drink, especially when an eggshell enters the story. 8. Coffee with eggshell. The internet says cowboys dropped eggshells into coffee to reduce acidity and settle the grounds. The strongest chuck wagon instructions describe a different trick. In 1865, Arbuckle Brothers began selling roasted coffee in packages, making it easier to move west. National Park Service chuck wagon materials describe boiling the coffee and then adding a little cold water so the grounds would settle to the bottom. Egg-based techniques existed in other camp kitchens and later recipes. But fresh eggs were fragile and do not appear as a dependable daily solution on months-long drives. The shell may survive in folklore. The splash of cold water has stronger documentation. For men starting before dawn, coffee meant warmth, routine, and alertness. The method had to work with few tools, avoid wasting an expensive supply, and not depend on something easily broken. Coffee was planned. The next pot depended on chance because the cattle surrounding the crew were merchandise, while supper might be running through the brush. 9. Hare stew. Even when surrounded by thousands of cattle, a cowboy could not simply choose one for supper. Each animal belonged to the herd that had to reach market alive. On the major trails leaving Texas between 1866 and the mid-1880s, chuck wagon records describe fresh beef when slaughter was authorized and game or fish when available. Rabbits and hares appear in frontier recollections, although hare stew is less visible in inventories than flour, rice, or canned goods. A game stew was opportunistic, not guaranteed. Movies turned the herd into an endless pantry, but cowboys were paid to protect that capital. A hare could bring variety without reducing the number of cattle the owner expected to sell. The cook had to decide whether hunting was worth the time, fuel, and risk of delaying a meal. When it was, stew stretched a small amount of meat across several bowls. On the northern plains, however, the real science of carrying meat over distance existed long before a chuck wagon reached Dakota. 10. Wasna. Wasna is not a forgotten recipe invented by cowboys. It is Plains indigenous food knowledge, and its story begins before any cattle trail crossed Dakota. North American Traditional Indigenous Food Systems describes wasna as a Lakota food, made with dried meat, fat, and, in some versions, fruit. In 19th century Dakota Territory, combinations like this could be stored for travel, hunting, and winter. Cowboys, traders, and frontier workers could encounter indigenous foods or related forms of pemmican. But that does not turn wasna into cowboy food. The honest evidence is contact and possible adoption, not cowboy authorship or universal chuck wagon use. Giving proper credit explains why the formula worked. It concentrated food and ecological knowledge into a portable serving created by communities that understood plains distances and winters long before newcomers arrived. One fruit that could accompany such foods also became pudding, again through a tradition the cowboy myth often hides. 11. Buffalo berry pudding. On dry grasslands, dessert did not have to come from a can. Small buffalo berries provided color, acidity, and food where an outsider might see only thorny brush. The University of Kansas American Indian Health and Diet Project documents buffalo berries used in puddings, porridges, sauces, and dried cakes by multiple indigenous nations. Fruit preparations such as wojapi also belong to Lakota traditions of the 19th century northern plains. Buffalo berry pudding does not appear as a standard chuck wagon dessert in supply records. Cowboys and ranch families could encounter, trade for, or learn to use local fruit, but the technique did not begin with them. The dish belongs first to the region's indigenous history. Knowing which fruit to gather, when it ripened, and how to process it could separate nourishment from seasonal hunger. For arriving workers, that local knowledge was worth more than any romantic image of total self-reliance. After fruit gathered from the land came an industrial technology that changed the campfire plate, the tin can, carrying an unlikely favorite. 12. Canned tomatoes with crackers. Among meat and beans, one of the chuck wagon's most desired goods could be canned tomatoes. Not because they were elegant, but because they offered something bad trail water did not. On January 11, 1885, a Cheyenne, Wyoming newspaper description of the cowboy mentioned meat stew, canned tomatoes, and fresh biscuits. Supply orders from ranches such as the Spur in Texas also listed canned tomatoes during the same period. Dry crackers or bread could be broken into the tomatoes, sometimes with sugar, forming a mixture remembered in some accounts as pooch. The liquid and acidity cut through fatty flavors and helped when water tasted poor. Opening a can delivered moisture, color, and variety without a garden. For a crew exhausted by repeated flavors, it could matter more than another serving of meat. When the cans were gone, the cook could still turn yesterday's cornmeal into a meal with an entirely different texture. 13. Fried mush. Fried mush answered a question the cook could not ignore. What should happen to cornmeal porridge that cooled and hardened overnight? Byron Price records cornmeal among provisions in cattle country before 1870. In 19th century American frontier kitchens, cold mush could be sliced and fried in fat. The leftover technique is well documented, even though specific mentions in cattle drive diaries are scarce. The dish did not require a new recipe. It required the cook to think about tomorrow. Letting mush set created slices that browned in a skillet and felt like a different meal while drawing from the same bag of meal. On a journey lasting months, repeating ingredients was unavoidable. Repeating sensation was not. Changing texture reduced monotony and recovered food that might otherwise stick to the pot or be discarded. Not every man stood near the skillet. For the night guard, the bed of coals itself could become an oven. 14. Night guard's ash biscuit. A night guard who could not leave the herd did not magically receive a perfect biscuit from the chuck wagon. Sometimes the answer was simple dough cooked wherever heat remained. On cattle drives from Texas to Abilene or Dodge City in the 1860s through 1880s, men rotated through the night to hold thousands of animals together. Open-range narratives mention ash cakes, simple dough placed near coals or protected beneath hot ashes. The phrase, night guard's ash biscuit, suggests a special standardized recipe. Historically, the method is safer than the label. It might be ash cake, quick bread, or biscuit dough depending on what remained and who was cooking. The fire let a man far from the wagon eat something warm without abandoning his post for long. On a cold night, that small food provided enough warmth and focus to respond to a stampede. No dish has been reshaped by movies and modern competitions more than the next red pot. 15. Chuck wagon chili. The image of chili simmering beside every cattle camp is so powerful it feels like a document. Real cowboy chili depended on region, culture, and supplies. Byron Price shows that cattle country kitchens in South Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, and California carried Mexican and vaquero influences, including chile, tortillas, rice, and other regional foods. In San Antonio, the chili queens made chili con carne famous in public plazas during the 1880s and 1890s. That proves chili's place in cattle culture, but not one universal chuck wagon chili served across the entire West. The standardized recipe, and today's argument about whether beans belong, came later.
Just a few more minutes
on the trail, a cook used the chile and meat actually available. The dish reveals a cultural borderland, not an isolated Anglo-cowboy invention. Vaqueros and Mexican communities helped create the flavor that entertainment later sold as a national cowboy symbol. But not every dessert on this list is surrounded by doubt. Some are almost too well documented, hiding in plain sight under a deceptively simple name. 16. Dried apple pie, cowboy pie. When the last fresh fruit of the season had been gone for months, one specific pie became almost synonymous with trail dessert across the entire West. Dried apples, rehydrated in hot water and cooked with sugar and spice inside a simple Dutch oven crust, are among the most widely cited desserts in frontier and chuck wagon cooking accounts between 1860 and 1890, precisely because dried apples kept for months without refrigeration. Unlike so many other desserts on this list, this pie did not depend on luck, hunting, or seasonal wild fruit. It was planned months in advance, part of the wagon's fixed stock. Its near-guaranteed presence, drive after drive, made it one of the rare sweet constants in a diet ruled by daily uncertainty. And if this dessert survived for months inside a sack, the next item on the list survived for years, guarded like a member of the crew. 17. Sourdough starter. Kept alive for years. Some chuck wagon cooks protected a single container more carefully than any gun or tool on the wagon, because if that container died, so did every loaf the crew would eat. Natural sourdough starter, continuously fed with flour and water, was kept alive by ranch cooks for years or even decades, a practice so central that many trail cooks were nicknamed directly sourdough in cattle drive records from the 1870s and 1880s. On nights of extreme cold, it was common for the cook to sleep with the starter container close to his body or near the fire, making sure the heat kept the culture from dying during the journey. Losing that starter did not mean losing one ingredient. It meant losing weeks of fresh bread until a new culture could be grown from scratch. And the final item on this list settles, once and for all, The confusion around the most misunderstood sauce in trail cooking. 18. Texas butter, the real name behind the skillet gravy. This gravy appears on nearly every modern list of cowboy food under a crude nickname. Yet the historians who actually research the source use a very different name. In descriptions of Texas and Plains ranches in the late 19th century, historian Richard Slatta documents this skillet fat, flour, and water gravy under the names Texas butter and Aesop. Not under the nickname that circulates widely online today. The gravy itself is entirely real and documented. What changes is only the name, showing how, over more than a century, a popular nickname can completely replace the term cowboys themselves actually used. Thickening skillet fat with flour and water increased the size of a meal and turned hard bread into something edible, the same logic of total use that appears in nearly all 18 items on this list. These 18 foods show that surviving the Wild West was not about enduring one heroic, unchanging diet. It meant combining chuck wagon logistics, reuse, indigenous knowledge, African-American traditions, vaquero influence, and later ranch inventions. And being honest enough to separate documents from legend. Almost everything the internet sells you today as authentic cowboy food is a Hollywood invention. And you just watch the proof, dish by dish. Subscribe now, because the next video tears apart another so-called Wild West classic that never existed the way you think. And before you go, tell us in the comments, which of these 18 dishes would you have sworn was 100% real?